Stay down. I told you to stay down.
I'm not resisting.
You walk in here dressed like that, expecting everyone to salute you. I don't care how many medals you pinned on. You don't get special treatment because you throw on a uniform.
My identification is valid. I've shown it.
4:14 p.m. on a Sunday evening inside Atlanta Hartsfield-Jackson International Airport, a black man in navy dress blues walked through the civilian terminal alone. His name was Senior Chief Darnell Osei. He was 38 years old, an active-duty Navy SEAL with more than 16 years in special operations. Less than 72 hours earlier, he had been emergency evacuated from a covert operation inside Iranian territory. The details of that mission would never be made public. What was visible were the marks it had left on him. A bandaged right hand, a sutured cut above his left eyebrow, eyes that hadn't closed in over 40 hours. He carried a duffel bag over one shoulder and a sealed military dossier under his arm, stamped with Department of Defense classification markings. He had been rerouted through Atlanta on a military transport connection and directed through the civilian terminal to catch a flight to Naval Station Norfolk, where a classified debrief was waiting. The terminal was busy with the usual Sunday evening crowd. Families returning from vacations, business travelers on red-eyes, flight crews moving between gates. Osei moved through them with the steady, controlled posture of a man trained to function under conditions that would break most people. His pace was even, his eyes forward, his uniform pressed despite everything he had been through. The ribbons on his chest told a story most people in that terminal couldn't begin to understand. He wasn't looking for attention. He wasn't making a scene. He was a wounded serviceman trying to get from one gate to another inside his own country. He just wanted to get to his flight. Officer Craig Bellingham stood near the international arrivals corridor with a coffee in one hand and his radio on his shoulder. He was 42 years old and had been with the Atlanta Airport Police Department for 16 years. In that time, 31 complaints had been filed against him, overwhelmingly by Black and Latino travelers. Excessive questioning, unnecessary pat-downs, aggressive detentions that led nowhere. Every single complaint had been investigated internally and cleared. Some were dismissed as misunderstandings. Others were filed away with vague notes about high-pressure situations. None of them ever stuck. Among certain colleagues, Bellingham had earned the nickname the Gatekeeper. He wore it with pride, never quite understanding the contempt behind it. His partner that evening was Officer Nolan Fitch, 29, 5 years on the job. Fitch was quieter, more cautious, and had learned early on that questioning Bellingham's instincts was not something you did twice. He stayed a step behind, watching the crowd, following Bellingham's lead without hesitation. Bellingham's eyes moved across the terminal the way they always did, scanning, sorting, deciding who belonged and who didn't. And then they locked on one traveler in particular, a black man in navy dress blues walking through the concourse with a duffel bag and a sealed envelope under his arm. Bandaged hand, cut above his eyebrow, tired eyes. Most people in that terminal would have seen a wounded serviceman coming home. Bellingham didn't. He saw a black man in a uniform that didn't sit right with him. He saw someone who didn't match his idea of what a senior chief was supposed to look like. He saw a target, and he was already moving. Bellingham stepped directly into Osei's path. The gap between them was less than 2 feet. "Hey, hold up! Where are you coming from?" Osei stopped. His posture stayed straight, his tone respectful. "Military travel, sir. I'm connecting through to Norfolk." Bellingham's eyes ran slowly over the dress blues, the ribbons, the bandaged hand, the sealed envelope under Osei's arm. He didn't step back. "You look like trouble. Where'd you get that injury?" Osei kept his voice level. "I'm returning from an overseas assignment. I have my military ID and travel orders if you'd like to verify." Bellingham held out his hand. "Let me see." Osei reached slowly into his jacket and produced his military ID and folded travel documents. Bellingham examined them the way a man examines something he's already decided is fake. He turned the ID over, looked at the photo, looked back at Osei, then shook his head. These could be fake. Guys buy these online all the time. They're not fake, sir. You can verify them through... I'll decide what I verify. Bellingham handed the ID to Fitch without looking at him. Osai's jaw tightened slightly. I'd like to speak with a supervisor. Bellingham's expression shifted. You don't get to make demands. Put the bags down. Both of them. Osai lowered the duffel to the floor, but he kept the sealed dossier under his arm. Sir, this document is classified military material. I'm not authorized to surrender it to civilian law enforcement. Bellingham stepped closer. His voice dropped, but carried enough to reach the travelers who were beginning to slow down and watch. I don't care what you call it. You put it down, or I'll put you down. Fitch shifted his weight behind them. His eyes moved to the growing number of phones being raised across the concourse. He said nothing. Osei placed nothing else on the ground. He held the dossier steady under his arm, his voice calm and clear. This document is classified. I am not authorized to release it. That was the last full sentence he got out before Bellingham grabbed his arm. The grip was hard and immediate, fingers locking around the same wrist that was already wrapped in gauze. Osei didn't pull away. He didn't shift his weight. He said, I am not resisting. This document is classified. Bellingham twisted the arm upward. The gauze tore slightly and Osei's jaw clenched, but he stayed still. Then Bellingham drove his open hand into Osei's upper back and shoved him forward. Osei's knees hit the tile first, then his shoulder, then the side of his face. The sealed dossier skid across the terminal floor, spinning to a stop near a row of seats. The sound of the impact echoed through the concourse. A woman gasped. A child near the window started crying. Fitch moved in fast and pinned Osei's legs to the floor. Bellingham dropped a knee between his shoulder blades and yanked both arms behind his back. The bandage on Osei's hand tore open completely. Blood smeared across the white tile. Stop resisting, Bellingham shouted. I have not moved, Osei said. His cheek was pressed flat to the floor. His breathing was controlled. You are on camera. Bellingham leaned close. The body cam on his chest was blinking red. It picked up every word. Guys like you always have a story. Uniform doesn't make you somebody. The concourse had gone still. A wall of phones surrounded them. A retired Marine colonel in a veteran's cap stepped forward, his voice hard. That man is in a Navy uniform. Let him go. Now. A young woman near the gate had her phone raised at arm's length, live streaming. The viewer count was already in the thousands. A white man in a business suit announced loudly, I'm an attorney, and what I'm watching is unlawful. Fitch leaned toward Bellingham, voice low. Craig, maybe we should check with a supervisor. Bellingham didn't look at him. He tightened the cuffs and stood up. Airport Police Sergeant Vanessa Trask came around the corner of Concourse B at a fast walk, drawn by the radio call Bellingham had put out and the sound of raised voices carrying down the terminal. She was 44 years old, 18 years on the job, and had supervised enough shifts to know the difference between a real incident and an officer making one. What she saw stopped her mid-stride. A black man in full Navy dress blues was face down on the terminal floor, blood on the tile beneath his hand, cuffs on his wrists, a knee mark still visible on the back of his jacket. 2 officers standing over him, and a sealed military dossier lying 10 feet away on the ground near a row of plastic seats, classification markings facing up for anyone to see. Trask moved fast. She stepped between Bellingham and the crowd, looked down at Osei, then back at Bellingham. Get him up. Now. Bellingham didn't move. He's non-compliant. Trask crouched slightly and picked up the military ID that Fitch was still holding. She read the name, the rank, the unit. Senior Chief Petty Officer, Naval Special Warfare. She stood slowly and looked Bellingham directly in the eyes. Her voice dropped low enough that only he and Fitch could hear. Craig, do you have any idea what you've done? Bellingham's jaw tightened. He was, take the cuffs off. Now. Bellingham didn't move. Trask didn't blink. That was not a request, officer. Fitch stepped forward and removed the cuffs. Osei rose slowly from the tile. His right hand was bleeding freely now, the bandage torn away completely. The cut above his eyebrow had reopened. He flexed his fingers, wincing, and looked at Trask. She met his eyes. "Senior Chief, I'm Sergeant Trask. I'm calling medical and my commanding officer right now." She walked to the dossier, picked it up carefully by the edges, and secured it under her arm. Then she keyed her radio. "Chief Pratt, this is Trask, Concourse B. I need you here immediately. We have a situation involving an active duty Special Operations Service member and classified military documents." Trask walked Osei down a side corridor and into a small conference room used for internal briefings. She offered him water and a chair. He took both. His posture was still straight, but the exhaustion was pulling at him now. 40-plus hours without sleep, a reopened wound, and the adrenaline beginning to drain from his system. Airport Chief Julius Pratt arrived within minutes. He was in his late 50s, calm, deliberate, and the moment he stepped into the room and saw the classification markings on the sealed dossier, his expression changed. He picked up the phone and dialed the Department of Defense liaison number. The call lasted less than 3 minutes. His voice was tight the entire time. "Yes, sir. Active duty. Naval Special Warfare. Classified material was on the floor of a public terminal. Body cam was rolling." He hung up and looked at Trask. Within 20 minutes, 2 men in civilian suits walked through the terminal without stopping at any checkpoint. One was from NCIS. The other carried credentials from the Defense Intelligence Agency. They secured the dossier first. Then they asked to see the body cam footage. The playback began in a closed room down the hall. It showed everything. The unprovoked stop, the profiling language, the refusal to accept valid military identification, the grab, the twist, the shove, the sound of Osei's body hitting the floor, the blood, the knee, and then the voice, clear and unmistakable. "Guys like you always have a story. Uniform doesn't make you somebody." It also showed the classified dossier skidding across a public terminal floor, visible to every camera and phone in the concourse. A potential intelligence breach caused entirely by one officer's decision to put a decorated serviceman on the ground. The DIA officer stepped out of the room and made a single phone call. His voice was flat. "We have a compromised asset situation and an assault on an active operator. Initiate federal jurisdiction." He hung up and walked back inside. Pratt looked at Trask. "Pull Bellingham and Fitch off duty immediately. Radios, weapons, badges, body cams, everything." The NCIS agent added without looking up from the screen, "And nobody talks to them before we do." A federal attorney reviewing the footage in Washington that same hour said it plainly. "This isn't misconduct. This is a federal crime on at least 4 counts." By the time the sun set over Atlanta that evening, the live stream from the terminal had crossed 2 million views and was still climbing. The young woman who had started recording near the gate had not stopped. Her footage showed everything from a civilian angle: the shove, the blood, the cuffs, the crowd's reaction, and the moment Trask arrived and shut it down. News outlets began calling the airport's communications office before the body cam footage had even finished its first internal review. Local affiliates ran the story at 10. Cable networks picked it up by midnight. By morning, it was national. The Pentagon released a formal statement within hours. It was unusually fast and unusually blunt. An active duty senior chief petty officer returning from a classified overseas operation was subjected to racially motivated assault by civilian law enforcement. The Department of Defense is cooperating fully with federal authorities and will ensure full accountability. In Washington, behind closed doors, the language was not diplomatic. A senior defense official stood before a room of JAG attorneys and investigators and said what the press release could not. He was evacuated under fire from a hostile nation. He survived what most people in this building will never have to face. And then he got his face put on the floor of an American airport because of the color of his skin. This ends careers. This ends freedom. There was no discussion after that, only action. the Department of Justice Civil Rights Division opened a formal investigation. Homeland Security's Office of Inspector General launched a parallel inquiry into airport police operations at Hartsfield-Jackson. NCIS formally assumed control of the criminal investigation, pulling jurisdiction from local authorities entirely. That same night, Senior Chief Darnell Osei sat in a quiet room at the airport and gave his full statement to a federal agent. His voice was steady. His recollection was precise. He described every word Bellingham had said, every point of physical contact, every second of the encounter, from the first step to the last cuff. The agent listened without interrupting. When Osei finished, the agent closed his notebook and said, "That's one of the clearest statements I've ever taken." Osei nodded once. "I was trained to remember details under pressure." Officer Craig Bellingham was placed on unpaid suspension the following morning. His badge was collected, his firearm was secured, his access card was deactivated. He was told not to contact any member of the department or any party involved in the investigation. He drove home in silence. Within 48 hours, his 31 prior complaints were pulled from internal files and placed under federal review. What the department had spent 14 years dismissing, the federal government began examining in detail. And then, the victims started coming forward. A black airline pilot named Captain Solomon Ibarra was the first to speak publicly. He described being stopped by Bellingham 2 years earlier while walking through the terminal in full uniform with his crew. Bellingham had detained him for 45 minutes, questioning whether his credentials were real, refusing to contact the airline for verification, and only releasing him after a gate supervisor intervened. Ibarra said he had filed a complaint. It was marked resolved, with no action taken. A Latino TSA supervisor named Hector Padilla came forward next. He described being accused by Bellingham of trespassing inside the terminal where he had worked for 9 years. Bellingham had demanded his employee badge, called it suspicious, and threatened to have him escorted out. Padilla had filed a formal grievance. It disappeared into the same internal system that had swallowed every other complaint. Then came a black mother named Simone Achebe. She had been traveling alone with her 8-month-old son when Bellingham pulled her aside for a random search. The search lasted over 30 minutes. She missed her flight. Her infant screamed the entire time. She said Bellingham told her that if she had nothing to hide, she wouldn't be so upset. She filed a complaint through the airport's public liaison office. She never received a response. 14 victims in total came forward within the first 2 weeks. Each story followed the same pattern. A person of color stopped without cause, a fabricated justification, an aggressive encounter, a complaint filed and buried. Internal emails surfaced during the federal review that confirmed what every victim already knew. Supervisors were aware. One email from a lieutenant sent 3 years earlier read plainly, "Bellingham's numbers are high, but he keeps the terminal clean. Let it go." That email would become the centerpiece of the federal investigation, not because of what it said about Bellingham, but because of what it proved about the department. They knew. They always knew. And they chose to look the other way. Craig Bellingham sat in his living room under the terms of his suspension. The television was on. His name was at the bottom of the screen. It had been there every day for weeks. His wife had stopped answering the phone. His former colleagues had distanced themselves completely. The union that had backed him through 31 complaints over 14 years had gone silent. No statement, no legal fund, nothing. Every day new coverage surfaced. Another prior victim interview. Another legal expert breaking down the body cam footage frame by frame. Another segment about the classified dossier that slid across a public terminal floor because one officer decided a black man in dress blues didn't look right. Outside the federal courthouse, protesters gathered with enlarged stills from the body cam footage. Bellingham's knee on Osei's back. The blood on the tile. The dossier on the ground with classification markings visible. Inside, attorneys prepared for what analysts were calling one of the most clear-cut federal civil rights cases in recent memory. The Pentagon had not withdrawn its statement. Federal monitors were already assigned to the airport police department before a verdict had been reached. Osei had not spoken publicly since his statement to NCIS. He had returned to limited duty at Naval Special Warfare Command. His commanding officer had made clear the Navy considered the matter far from resolved. The body cam footage had crossed 30 million views. It had been entered into federal evidence. It would be played in a courtroom. Every frame, every word, every second of a decorated Navy SEAL's face pressed to the floor of an American airport while bleeding from wounds he received serving his country. And somewhere between a federal investigation and charges that could reach 20 years, a man who survived extraction from hostile territory in Iran sat in uniform, waiting for a system that failed him on a terminal floor to decide whether it would fail him again. The cameras were still rolling. The world was still watching. And this story was not over. If this story moved you, don't just watch in silence. This case was disturbing, but the one on the right ends in a way no one expects.